wind tells the oldest stories out here in the Montana territories, stories of hardship and bone-deep loneliness. It whispers of men who grew as large and silent as the mountains they called home. Our story is of such a man, a giant named Bo Maverick, whose shadow was long enough to cover a grave, but whose heart was a vast, unclaimed land. He thought he knew the shape of his solitude, every sharp edge and empty space. But on a night when the moon was a splinter in the eye of the sky, he found a story sleeping in his own stable, a woman and her child refugees from a world of violence he could barely fathom. This isn't just a tale of the Wild West. It's the story of how a gentle giant's quiet world was shattered and rebuilt by the one thing he never expected to find a family worth fighting for. The Maverick Ridge Ranch wasn't a place you stumbled upon. It was a destination born of purpose and isolation, carved into the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Its owner, Bo Maverick, was carved from the same stone. He wasn't just a tall man, he was a monument of one. Standing a hand over 6.5 feet, with shoulders that strained the seams of any store-bought coat, Bo moved with a deliberate slowness, a conscious effort to contain the immense strength coiled in his limbs. His silence was often mistaken for menace by the townsfolk of Redemption Creek, but it was really a form of caution. In a world built for smaller men, he'd learned early that every movement, every word carried an outsized impact. His ranch was his sanctuary, a sprawling kingdom of whispering pines and wide-open pastures where the only judgment came from the sky. His life was a rhythm of hard work, mending fences at dawn, tending to his herd of Hereford cattle under the midday sun, and falling into his custom-built bed at dusk, exhausted and alone. His only companion was Gus, a wiry, sun-cured old ranch hand with a tongue as sharp as his spurs and a loyalty as unshakable as the mountains themselves. On this particular evening in late October of 1888, a bitter wind clawed at the homestead, promising an early winter. Bo had just finished a late supper of beans and bacon when he noticed his prize stallion Apollo was restless in the stable, kicking at his stall door with an agitated rhythm. Pulling on his heavy sheepskin coat, Bo stepped out into the biting cold, the lantern in his huge hand casting a wobbling circle of gold. The stable smelled of hay horse and the coming frost. Apollo whinnied softly as Bo approached, his dark eyes wide. "Easy, boy," Bo rumbled his voice, a low vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards. "What's got you so spooked?" He ran a hand down the horse's powerful neck, but his gaze swept the cavernous space. Everything seemed in its place, the neatly stacked bales of hay, the gleaming rows of tack, the sleeping barn cats curled in a basket. Then he saw it. In the deepest, quietest corner, a space usually reserved for birthing mares, a mound of loose hay shifted. Bo froze. A mountain lion would have sent the horses into a frenzy. A drifter would have likely stolen something and been long gone. He set the lantern on a nearby barrel, the light stretching the shadows into grotesque figures. He moved with a predator's silence, his massive frame belying his grace. Peeking over the edge of the empty stall, his breath caught in his chest. Curled in a makeshift nest of hay was a woman, her face pale and smudged with dirt in the lantern light. Her worn calico dress was thin and offered little protection against the cold. Tucked against her chest, sheltered by her body, was a small boy no older than 5, his hair the color of corn silk. They were both sound asleep, lost in the deep, defenseless slumber of the utterly exhausted. The woman's face, even in sleep, was etched with worry. There were faint, bluish marks on her cheekbone, barely visible beneath the grime. Her hands were raw and chapped, clutching the boy's small form as if he were the last anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Bo had seen frightened things before, a cornered coyote, a spooked colt. But this was different. This was a human fear so profound it had chased its victims to the brink of collapse in his stable. His first instinct was to retreat, to leave them be. His world was ordered simple. This woman and child were a complication, a piece of the messy outside world he'd worked so hard to keep at a distance. But he couldn't. The boy coughed in his sleep, a dry, rasping sound that spoke of a deep chest cold. The woman shivered, pulling the thin layer of hay tighter around them. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. He couldn't leave them to freeze. He couldn't scare them into running off into the unforgiving night. Returning to his cabin, he moved with uncharacteristic urgency. He stoked the fire in the hearth until it blazed with warmth. He ladled leftover stew into a bowl, found a tin cup for milk, and cut a thick slice of bread. He also fetched a heavy wool blanket from his own bed. Carrying the offerings carefully, he returned to the stable. The woman was still asleep. He knelt the old wood groaning under his weight. He reached out a hand, calloused and wide as a dinner plate, and hesitated. He touched her shoulder with the very tips of his fingers, a touch so light it was barely there. "Ma'am," he said, his voice, a soft baritone, stripped of its usual rumbling power. Her eyes flew open. They were the color of a summer sky, and for a split second, they held only disorientation. Then they found him. They widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. She scrambled backward, pulling the boy behind her, her body forming a shield. A small, terrified sound escaped her lips. Bo immediately pulled his hand back, raising both in a gesture of peace. "Easy now. I mean you no harm," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "My name is Bo Maverick. This is my property." The woman said nothing, her breathing ragged. She was cornered and she knew it. "You're safe here," he continued, pushing the bowl of stew and the blanket gently toward her. "The boy, he sounds like he's got a bad cough. It's warm inside my cabin. There's a fire. You can take the spare room." Her eyes darted from his face to the food, then back. The animal panic in them slowly subsided, replaced by a wary, desperate calculation. She was judging him, weighing the danger of the giant before her against the certain danger of the cold and whatever she was running from. The warmth from the stew wafted towards her, a promise of life and comfort her body craved. "Why?" she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. Bo considered the question. He could have given a dozen practical reasons, but he spoke the simple truth. "Because it's a cold night," he said, "and no one should have to sleep in a barn when there's a warm bed nearby." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the lifetime of mistrust battling a moment of desperate need. He saw the way she glanced at her son, and in that glance, he saw her decision. For the boy, she would risk anything, even trusting a giant. Slowly she nodded. Bo stood and backed away, giving her space. He watched as she gently woke her son, whispering to him, her voice a soothing murmur. The boy Samuel coughed again as he stirred, his eyes bleary with sleep. He took one look at Bo's towering silhouette in the doorway and hid his face in his mother's dress. She coaxed him to his feet, and holding his hand tightly, she walked toward the cabin, never taking her eyes off Bo. As she passed him, he saw the full extent of her exhaustion. She was running on nothing but a mother's will. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire enveloped them. She guided her son to the small table and sat him down, her movements stiff. Bo placed the food before them. The boy stared at the stew as if it were a miracle. His mother, however, wouldn't eat until her son had taken his first few spoonfuls. Bo retreated to the far side of the room, near the hearth, trying to make himself smaller, less intimidating. He watched them in the flickering firelight. He didn't know their names, or where they came from, or what darkness had chased them to his door. All he knew was that for the first time in a very long time, his vast, lonely house held more than one heartbeat. And in that moment, as the woman finally raised a spoonful of stew to her own lips, her shoulders slumping in weary relief, an unfamiliar, fierce protectiveness washed over him. He had found them in his stable, but he felt with a certainty that shook him to his core that he could not let them go. The first days were a delicate dance of silence and space. The woman who introduced herself simply as Brianna and her son Samuel occupied the small guest room at the back of the cabin. It was a room Beau had used for storage, filled with old saddles and spare tools, but he'd cleared it out, put fresh linens on the narrow bed, and made sure a small fire was always glowing in its pot-bellied stove. Brianna was like a phantom in his home. She moved with a quiet efficiency, always present, but never underfoot. She would rise before dawn, and by the time Beau came in from his morning chores, a pot of coffee would be brewing, and a simple breakfast of oatmeal or fried eggs would be on the table. She refused to be idle. She mended Beau's work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She scrubbed the floors until the pine planks shone. She worked as if she were trying to pay a debt, her hands never still, her eyes always watchful. Samuel was her shadow, a solemn, quiet boy. With his mother's sky-blue eyes, he clung to her dress, his gaze constantly flicking toward the giant of a man who now shared their world. Beau, acutely aware of the boy's fear, made a point of being gentle in his presence. He softened his voice, slowed his movements even further. He would sit at the far end of the long dining table, giving them as much room as possible. One afternoon, he found a smooth piece of pine wood and spent the evening by the fire, his large hands, surprisingly nimble, carving the wood with a small whittling knife. The next morning, a perfectly formed wooden horse, complete with a tiny saddle and flowing mane, sat beside Samuel's breakfast plate. The boy stared at it, his eyes wide with wonder. He looked at his mother, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Hesitantly, Samuel reached out and touched the toy. It was the first time Beau saw the boy smile, a fleeting, shy curve of his lips that felt like the sun breaking through clouds. Gus Beau's crusty ranch hand observed the new arrivals with a skeptical eye. He'd found Brianna's story of getting lost on the way to visit family in Bozeman as thin as watered-down whiskey. "That woman's running from something fierce, Beau," Gus said one afternoon as they were re-shoeing a mare. "Seen that look before. It's the look of a rabbit that knows the wolf is on its trail." "She needed a place to stay, Gus," Beau replied, his voice firm, discouraging further questions. "The boy was sick." "He ain't sick now," Gus grunted, gesturing with his head toward the cabin where Samuel could be seen through the window, trotting the wooden horse along the windowsill. "Thanks to her nursing and your roof. But trouble follows folks like that. It's got a scent, and it'll follow 'em right here to Maverick Ridge." Beau knew Gus was right, but he didn't care. The cold silence of his cabin had been replaced by the soft hum of life. The scent of baking bread now mingled with the smell of wood smoke and leather. He'd catch Brianna humming a soft lullaby to Samuel at night, a sound so achingly gentle it made his chest tight. He was beginning to realize how starved his life had been of softness, of warmth, of anything beyond the harsh demands of the land. Brianna, for her part, began to slowly unfurl. The deep-set fear in her eyes started to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She started asking questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about the names of the surrounding peaks. Beau would answer in his usual terse way, but he found himself wanting to say more, to share the small joys of his world with her. One evening, as she was clearing the supper dishes, she paused. "Mr. Maverick," she began, her voice soft. "It's Bo," he corrected her gently. "Bo," she repeated, testing the name. "Thank you for all of this. We won't be a burden for much longer. As soon as I can figure out our next move." "There's no hurry," Bo said, perhaps a little too quickly. "Winter's setting in. The passes will be snowed over soon. It's no time for traveling, especially with a boy." She looked at him, her gaze direct and searching. She was trying to read his motives, to understand the kindness of this massive, quiet man. Kindness, he suspected, was a foreign currency in the country she came from. The turning point came a week later. Bo was in town Redemption Creek to pick up supplies. The town was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings, huddled along a single main street. As usual, folks gave him a wide berth. Conversations paused as he entered the general store. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, and town's foremost gossip treated him with a nervous deference. As he was loading sacks of flour and sugar onto his wagon, Sheriff Brody approached him. Brody was a decent man, pragmatic and weary, a man who preferred peace to justice, if it meant less paperwork. "Bo," the sheriff said, nodding. "Heard you might have some company up at the ridge." Bo didn't flinch. He continued tying down his supplies. "Might." "Folks are talking," Brody went on, lowering his voice. "A woman and a boy appeared out of nowhere. Some folks get nervous about strangers." "They're no trouble," Bo stated flatly. "Maybe not," Brody conceded. But a telegraph came through this morning, from the Pinkerton Agency office in Cheyenne. "A man down there, a Mr. Corbin Wexler, has put out a substantial reward for information on his missing wife and stepson." Brody pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Wife's name is Brianna. Stepson's name is Samuel." Bo's blood ran cold. He stopped what he was doing, but forced himself to remain calm. Wexler. The name sounded like a whip crack. Brody watched him closely. "Description seems to match what I've been told. Woman in her late 20s, fair hair, blue eyes. Boy about 5. The notice says she's prone to fits of melancholy and confusion, and that Wexler is deeply concerned for their welfare." Bo knew that language. It was the language of control, the words of a man painting his victim as unstable to justify his pursuit. "Don't know anyone by that name," Bo lied, his voice a low growl. The lie felt foreign and bitter in his mouth. Sheriff Brody sighed, folding the paper and tucking it away. "All right, Bo. But you know how this works. A reward that big. It makes people talkative. It makes them watchful. Men will ride out from Cheyenne. Men who aren't as patient as I am. If you happen to see a woman and a boy matching that description, you tell them that Mr. Wexler just wants his family back." Bo merely grunted, swung himself up onto the wagon seat, and snapped the reins. He didn't look back as he rode out of town, but he could feel the sheriff's eyes on his back. The name echoed in his mind, Corbin Wexler. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of grim thoughts. The wolf Gus had spoken of now had a name, and it was coming. The fragile peace he had built around Brianna and Samuel was about to be shattered. When he arrived, he saw Brianna in the yard, throwing feed to the chickens with Samuel trailing happily behind her. She looked up and smiled at him, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up her whole face. In that moment, Bo Maverick made a choice. Maverick Ridge was his fortress. He had built it to keep the world out. Now he would use it to keep them in, safe. The world could send its wolves. They would find him waiting. He was no longer just a man on a lonely patch of land. He was a guardian, and he would not fail. The Pinkerton notice was a poison that seeped into the soil of Redemption Creek, making suspicion sprout like a weed. Men who usually averted their eyes from Beau Maverick now watched him with a new, calculating glint. The reward, a staggering $500, was enough to buy a man a small herd, a piece of land, a new life. It was a powerful temptation in a land where lives were cheap. Beau kept the news from Brianna. He saw no reason to return the terror to her eyes when it hadn't yet reached their doorstep. Instead, he became more vigilant. He began carrying his Colt Peacemaker on his hip, even when doing chores around the ranch, a habit he'd long since abandoned. At night, he wouldn't go to bed, but would sit in his armchair by the dying fire, his old Winchester rifle resting across his knees, listening to the sounds of the night, distinguishing the call of an owl from the snap of a twig that was too close, too human. Brianna noticed the change in him. She saw the new tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. "Is everything all right, Beau?" she asked one evening, her brow furrowed with concern. "Just the time of year," he'd answered, his voice steady. "Coyotes get bold when the weather turns." It was a half-truth, and they both knew it. The first sign of real trouble arrived on a grey, spitting afternoon, a week after Beau's trip to town. He was out on the range, miles from the cabin, searching for a stray calf, when he saw the rider. The man was a stranger, thin and wiry, mounted on a tired-looking roan. He wasn't riding the main trail, but was cutting across the open land, moving with a furtive, searching pattern. Beau watched from a ridge, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. The man had the look of a predator sniffing the air, and Beau's instincts screamed that this was not a lost traveler. He urged his horse Apollo into a wide, silent circle, using the terrain to stay hidden as he tracked the man. The rider eventually made his way to a high bluff overlooking the Maverick Ranch. He dismounted, pulled a spyglass from his saddlebag, and settled in to watch the cabin. Beau's blood turned to ice. He could see Brianna moving in the yard, shaking out a rug. He could see Samuel playing near the porch with his wooden horse. They were exposed, vulnerable, and this man was watching them like a hawk watches a field mouse. Beau didn't act immediately. A direct confrontation would only confirm the man's suspicions. Instead, he waited. He memorized the man's face, narrow with beady eyes, and a perpetual sneer, and the distinct brand on his horse's flank. After nearly an hour, the rider seemed satisfied, packed up his spyglass, and rode off, not back toward town, but east in the direction of the pass that led toward Cheyenne. Beau rode back to the cabin with a grim urgency. The wolf had found the trail. That night, a storm rolled in a furious, violent squall that threw sheets of rain against the windows and rattled the cabin's very foundations. The wind howled like a banshee. In the middle of the maelstrom, Samuel's dry cough returned with a vengeance. By midnight, he was burning with fever, his breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Brianna was frantic. She sat by his bed, bathing his forehead with cool water, her face a mask of terror. "It's his lungs," she whispered to Beau, her voice trembling. "He had it once before when he was a baby. It nearly took him." Beau looked at the sick child, his small face flushed and beaded with sweat. He knew what this was. Lung fever, pneumonia. It took children and strong men alike. The home remedies Brianna was trying weren't enough. They needed a doctor. "I'm going to town," Beau announced, pulling on his oilskin slicker. "No!" Brianna cried, her eyes wide with panic. "You can't. Not now. They'll be looking for us. That's why you've been so on edge, isn't it? He's found us." It wasn't a question. "The boy needs Dr. Peterson," Beau said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And he needs him now." Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." He didn't wait for a reply. He saddled Apollo the powerful horse, steady even in the driving wind and rain. The 10-mile ride to Redemption Creek was a treacherous battle against the elements. The trail was a river of mud, and the wind threatened to tear him from the saddle. But all he could see was Samuel's feverish face. All he could hear was the boy's strained breathing. He reached the town just before 2 in the morning. It was a ghost town, shuttered and dark against the storm. He went straight to Dr. Peterson's house, his heavy fist hammering on the door, until a light appeared in an upstairs window. Dr. Peterson was a good man, old and kind, dedicated to his profession above all else. He took one look at Beau's drenched form and grim face and knew this was no social call. "What is it, Beau?" "It's a child." Beau said, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "At my ranch. A boy. He's burning with fever and he can't catch his breath." The doctor didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, dressed quickly, and gathered his medical bag. As they were preparing the doctor's buggy, a light flickered on in the saloon across the street. The door opened, and a man stepped out onto the boardwalk, drawn by the commotion. It was the weasel-faced man from the bluff. Beau saw the doctor's bag, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He melted back into the shadows of the saloon, but the damage was done. Beau knew with sickening certainty that a telegraph would be humming its way to Cheyenne before dawn. The ride back was even more fraught. They had to get to Samuel, but Beau also knew they were now in a race against time. A race against Corbin Wexler and the men he would send. Dr. Peterson worked on Samuel for over an hour, his weathered face a study in concentration. He administered laudanum to ease the boy's breathing and packed his chest with a mustard plaster. "The crisis will be in the next 12 hours, the doctor said to Beau and Brianna, his voice grave. "The fever needs to break. All we can do is watch him, keep him warm, and pray." The doctor, exhausted, agreed to stay until morning. Brianna refused to leave her son's side, her hand never leaving his forehead. Beau took up his post by the main window, his Winchester in his lap, watching the storm finally begin to break, and the first grey, watery light of dawn creep over the mountains. The doctor's presence had saved Samuel, but it had also been a beacon. The weasel whose name Beau would later learn was Finn Riley, a notorious bounty hunter, had seen it. The secret of Maverick Ridge was out. The clock was ticking, and as Beau watched the eastern horizon, he knew that more than just the sun would be rising. Real trouble was on its way. The day after the storm was unnervingly beautiful. The sky was scrubbed clean, and the wet earth smelled of pine and renewal. Inside the cabin, however, the air was thick with tension. Dr. Peterson had left at midday with a promise to return, leaving behind medicine and strict instructions. Samuel's fever still hadn't broken. He was sleeping a restless, shallow sleep, his small chest rattling with each breath. Brianna sat by his side, a pale sentinel, her face a canvas of exhaustion and fear. Beau moved about his chores with a grim purpose. He wasn't just mending fences, he was fortifying them. He wasn't just chopping wood, he was creating obstacles. He hauled heavy logs and positioned them near the main approach to the ranch house, creating a crude but effective barricade. He checked his supply of ammunition, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Gus, sensing the shift in the air, worked alongside him without a word, his grizzled face set in hard lines. "They comin', ain't they?" Gus finally asked, as they were securing the corral gate. "They are," Beau confirmed, "just for the woman and the boy. That's what they'll say." Beau paused, his gaze fixed on the distant trail. "But I have a feeling it's more than that." Gus spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Well, this ranch has stood through blizzards, droughts, and bear attacks. Reckon it can stand through a passel of city slicker gunsells." The affirmation, simple and solid, was a comfort. Bo was not entirely alone. The riders came in the late afternoon. 3 of them. They topped the rise a mile out, their silhouettes stark against the bright blue sky. They weren't a posse, they were professionals. They rode with a swaggering confidence, their dusters pulled back to reveal holstered pistols. Leading them was Finn Riley, the weasel-faced man, a smug look of victory on his face. Bo sent Gus to the cabin. "Stay with them, bar the door, keep them away from the windows." Gus nodded, grabbing an old shotgun from the barn before heading inside. Bo walked to the center of the yard, stopping just before the crude barricade he'd built. He stood there, his feet planted wide, his hands empty at his sides. He was an immovable object, a figure of sheer intimidating scale against the backdrop of his home. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to understand what they were up against. The 3 riders pulled up about 30 yards away. Finn Riley smirked. "Maverick, we know you got 'em in there. The woman Brianna and the boy. Her husband, Mr. Wexler, sent us to escort them home. Be a good fellow and send them out. There's a reward in it for you if you cooperate." "The lady and her son are under my protection." Bo's voice boomed across the yard, deep and resonant. "They're not going anywhere." One of Riley's companions, a burly man with a cruel mouth, laughed. "Protection. Listen to the big man. We have papers, Maverick. A legal writ from a judge in Cheyenne. She's his wife. The boy is his property. This is my property." Bo countered his voice, dropping to a dangerous calm. "And on my property, my word is the only law that matters. You're trespassing. Turn around and ride out." Riley's smirk vanished, replaced by a snarl. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. It's all the same to us. We get paid either way." He subtly shifted in his saddle, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. "There's only one way this happens," Bo said slowly, his eyes locking onto Riley's. "And it ends with you in the ground." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the burly man decided Bo was bluffing. "Let's take him!" he growled, and his hand shot down for his gun. He never cleared the leather. Bo's hand, which had seemed so relaxed at his side, moved in a blur. The Colt Peacemaker was in his fist, roaring to life before anyone could process the motion. The shot was perfect. The burly man was thrown from his saddle, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The 3rd man, younger and less seasoned, panicked. He drew his weapon and fired wildly. The bullet whizzed past Bo's head, close enough to make him feel the heat. Bo didn't flinch. He simply shifted his aim and fired again. The 2nd man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he toppled from his horse. Finn Riley the weasel was faster. He'd managed to get his pistol out and fired a shot that gouged a long splinter from the barricade near Bo's leg. But he was a bounty hunter, not a gunfighter. He was used to cornering the weak, not facing down a mountain. He saw the cold fury in Bo's eyes, saw the smoking barrel of the Colt swinging toward him, and his nerve broke. With a yelp of fear, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it into a frantic gallop, retreating the way he'd come, leaving his companions behind. Bo held his fire. He watched Riley disappear over the rise, a fleeing coward. He knew Riley wasn't giving up. He was going back for reinforcements. This was just the first wave. Bo walked over to the man he'd shot in the shoulder. The man was groaning, clutching the wound. The other man was still, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The cold reality of what he'd just done washed over Bo. He had killed a man in his own front yard. He had drawn a line in the dust with blood. He dragged the wounded man into the barn and tied him up grimly, tending to his wound to keep him from bleeding out. He then dealt with the dead man, a somber, heavy task that left a metallic taste in his mouth. When he finally went back into the cabin, Brianna was standing there, her face ashen. She had heard the gunshots. "What happened?" she whispered. "Trouble came calling." Bo said, his voice weary. "I sent it away. For now." He looked past her toward the bedroom. "The boy. His fever." She said, a small, wondrous light breaking through the horror on her face. "It broke just a few minutes ago. He's sleeping peacefully." Relief, profound and overwhelming, flooded through Bo. It was as if the gunfight had been a fever of its own, a violent crisis that had now passed, leaving a fragile peace in its wake. He had taken a life to protect this small, broken family. He looked at Brianna, at the hope warring with fear in her eyes, and he knew, without a single doubt, that he would do it again. He would burn the whole world down before he let Corbin Wexler lay a hand on her or the boy. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Bo Maverick knew exactly what he was fighting for. The fragile peace was short-lived. The wounded gunslinger, a man named Brody, was tight-lipped and sullen, but Bo knew his presence was a ticking clock. Finn Riley would return, and he wouldn't come back with just 2 men. He'd come back with an army, and he'd likely have Sheriff Brody and the law on his side, waving Wexler's legal papers. That evening, as Brianna watched over a recovering Samuel, who was now awake and sipping broth, Bo knew he could no longer afford to be in the dark. He needed the truth. All of it. He approached Brianna gently. She looked up her relief over Samuel's health, making her seem younger, but the underlying fear was a permanent shadow in her eyes. "Brianna," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk. I need to know why Corbin Wexler wants you back so badly. It's more than just a husband wanting his wife. Men don't send professional trackers and killers for that, not unless there's something else at stake." Brianna flinched at the name, her whole body tensing. She looked at her sleeping son, then back at Bo, at his earnest, grim face. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind one takes before diving into icy water. "You're right," she whispered. "It's not about me. Not really. It's about what I know, and what I took." She led him to her small room. From the bottom of her worn satchel, wrapped in oilcloth, she pulled out a small, leather-bound book. A ledger. She placed it on the small table between them. "My father was a notary in Laramie." She began, her voice gaining a strength Bo hadn't heard before. "His name was Robert Dawson. He was respected, honest to a fault. Corbin Wexler arrived in town about 3 years ago. He was charming, wealthy, and full of promises about investing in the railroad and bringing prosperity. He bought up land, started businesses. Everyone was dazzled by him. I was too." Her expression soured with self-recrimination. "My first husband died of influenza a year prior, leaving me with Samuel and very little else. When Corbin started courting me, it felt like a rescue. He offered security, a future for my son. I was a fool. I married him." She paused, tracing the cover of the ledger. The charm was a mask. The man underneath was a monster, cruel, possessive. He saw Samuel not as a son, but as a rival for my attention. He saw me as another one of his acquisitions. But his real business, his true passion, was theft. Grand theft on a scale I could barely comprehend. She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat columns of names, dates and figures written in a precise, elegant hand. Corbin Wexler didn't buy most of his land. Brianna explained, her finger tapping a column of names. He stole it. He and a corrupt surveyor would find parcels of land owned by homesteaders who were struggling or whose titles were old and poorly filed. They would forge new deeds, create fake sale documents. My father, as the town notary, was essential. Wexler would pressure him, threaten him to apply his official seal to these fraudulent documents. For a while my father refused, but Wexler was persuasive. He threatened me. He threatened Samuel. Bo listened, his fists clenching, a cold rage building in his gut. My father was a broken man. Brianna continued, a tear tracing a clean path through the weariness on her cheek. He did what Wexler wanted, but he kept a secret record. This ledger. It details every fraudulent transaction. The real landowner, the date of the forgery, the amount Wexler paid the surveyor. It's proof that Wexler's entire empire is built on a foundation of lies and stolen futures. One night about a month ago, my father came to me. He was terrified. He said Wexler was getting sloppy, getting paranoid. He feared Wexler was going to clean house to get rid of anyone who knew the truth. He gave me the ledger. He told me to run, to take Samuel and disappear. He said he would try to meet me in Oregon. She choked back a sob. 2 days later, the Laramie newspaper reported that my father, Robert Dawson, had died in a fire at his office. An accident, they called it. A lantern knocked over. But I know better. Wexler murdered him. He killed my father to silence him. Now Bo understood the desperation, the relentless pursuit. This wasn't about a runaway wife. Brianna wasn't a possession Wexler wanted back. She was a witness. And the ledger in her hands was a weapon that could bring his whole world crashing down. The story about her being confused and melancholy was a lie to discredit her, to make sure no one would ever listen if she tried to tell her story. "I ran," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I took what little cash I had and just ran. I was trying to get to the Oregon Trail, but I heard Wexler had Pinkertons watching all the main routes. I thought if I cut north through the mountains, I could lose them. I was lost, freezing and out of food when I found your stable." She finally looked up, her blue eyes meeting his. "Now you know. You've killed a man for me, Bo. You've put yourself and your home in the path of a monster. You should tell me to leave. You have every right." Bo reached across the table and placed his huge hand over hers, covering it completely. His touch was warm and steady. "Brianna," he said, his voice rumbling with a fierce certainty. "This is your home now. Your fight is my fight." He looked from her face to the ledger. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to form in his mind. They couldn't just hide and wait for the siege. They had to change the fight. "He's using the law as his weapon," Bo said, thinking aloud. "So we have to show everyone that he is the one who broke it." He knew it was a long shot. They were two people and a crusty old ranch hand against a wealthy, powerful man with the law in his pocket. But for the first time, they had more than just fear and desperation. They had proof. They had the truth written in black and white in a dead man's ledger, and Bo Maverick would make sure the truth saw the light of day, even if it meant tearing down Corbin Wexler's empire, one bullet, one lie at a time. 2 days later, as the sun began its descent and painted the canyons in hues of blood and rust, they came. A small army appeared on the horizon, their forms dark against the dying light. Bo counted 12 men, a grim collection of hard-faced gunslingers and nervous deputies, whose silver stars glinted with uncertainty. At their head rode Finn Riley, his face alight with vengeful glee. Beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Sheriff Brody. But it was the third man who drew all of Bo's attention, Corbin Wexler. He sat atop a magnificent black stallion, a figure of immaculate, jarring elegance. His tailored suit and polished boots were an affront to the rugged landscape, his cold eyes sweeping over Maverick Ridge, not as a home, but as a final obstacle to be removed. Bo stood on the porch of his cabin, his Winchester held loosely. Inside, Brianna barred the final window, while Gus settled into the hayloft of the barn, a silent shadow with a shotgun. Maverick. Wexler's cultured voice carried a note of absolute command. "You have been a fool. You are harboring a thief and a fugitive. I have a legal warrant for the return of my wife, Brianna Wexler, and for your arrest on charges of kidnapping and murder. Send her out this instant, and I will instruct Sheriff Brody to show you leniency." Bo's feet were planted, as if he'd grown from the porch itself. "Her name is Brianna Dawson." His voice boomed back a clap of thunder against Wexler's silken threats. "And your pieces of paper mean nothing here, Wexler. This is my land. You are a thief, a murderer, and a trespasser." A short, ugly laugh escaped Wexler's lips. The desperate lies of a desperate woman. "It won't save you." "Sheriff," he commanded, "you have your orders. Take the ranch." Sheriff Brody shifted in his saddle, his face a mask of conflict. His gut screamed that Wexler was the real criminal. He looked from Wexler's cold smirk to the unyielding figure of Bo Maverick, a man he was beginning to see as a bastion of integrity. "Bo!" The sheriff called out, his voice strained. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Let the law sort it out." "What law?" Brody, Bo shouted back. "His law. The law he buys with stolen money. Look at the company he keeps." He gestured toward Finn Riley and the cold-eyed men beside him. "Are these the men you stand with?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Sheriff Brody looked from the hired guns to his own nervous deputies. He made his decision. With a subtle pull on the reins, he moved his horse to the side, creating a clear space between his men and Wexler's. "This is Bo Maverick's private land," Sheriff Brody declared, his voice ringing with newfound resolve. "We will not open fire on a man's home on the authority of an out-of-territory writ. My deputies and I are here to keep the peace, Mr. Wexler, not to serve as your private army." Wexler's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You gutless coward!" "Fine, if the law won't do its job, I will—" He turned to Riley, his voice a venomous hiss. "She's in there, and so is my ledger. I want them both. Burn the place to the ground if you have to." The first volley of shots erupted, splintering the porch posts around Bo. The siege had begun. Bo returned fire, his Winchester barking a steady rhythm. From the hayloft, Gus's shotgun boomed, sending two men scrambling for cover. Sheriff Brody and his men pulled back, taking cover and becoming unwilling referees in a war they had refused to start. The fight raged as dusk bled into a moonless twilight. Wexler's men were numerous, but Bo and Gus held the advantage of fortification. They made every shot count, yet for every one they fired, 5 were returned, in a relentless barrage that chewed at the wood of the cabin and barn. Inside, Brianna was a pillar of terrified strength. She had ushered Samuel into the root cellar, singing him soft lullabies to drown out the deafening roar of the gun battle. Her real work was above ground. With a frantic, focused energy, she moved between ammunition boxes and Bo's firing positions, reloading rifles with hands now smudged with gunpowder and grime. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was eclipsed by a fierce, burning resolve. Hours passed. The cabin was a wreck, the air thick with smoke. They were running low on ammunition. Wexler, enraged by the stubborn resistance, decided to end it. "The barn!" he screamed, his voice raw. "Set the barn on fire! Smoke them out like rats!" Bo saw the flickering of torches as Finn Riley and another man scurried forward under covering fire. They reached the side of the barn, the dry wood a perfect tinderbox. He knew Gus was trapped. With a roar that was more animal than human, Bo burst from the front door, firing his Winchester from his hip. He charged across the open yard, a giant silhouette against the torchlight, a figure of pure fury. The gunman, stunned by the sheer audacity of the charge, faltered. Bo reached the barn just as flames began to lick up the side wall. He grabbed the man with Riley by the collar, lifted him effortlessly, and used him as a human shield as Riley fired a panicked shot. He threw the gunman into Riley, sending them both tumbling into the dust, and stomped out the flames with his heavy boots. But the victory left him exposed. From the line of trees, Corbin Wexler, seeing his chance, raised his own rifle and took careful aim at the giant's broad back, a cold, triumphant smile on his lips. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, the frantic ringing of a bell from Redemption Creek. Then another. Lights appeared on the trail, dozens of them lanterns on wagons and men on horseback. Dr. Peterson was at the lead, his buggy filled with other ranchers and townsfolk, armed with hunting rifles, and a sense of frontier justice. Wexler stared, his mouth agape, as his hired army, seeing the approaching force, began to melt back into the trees. In a final desperate act of hatred, he swung his rifle back to Bo. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me, Maverick," he screamed. But as he pulled the trigger, another shot rang out, sharp and clear from the cabin's porch. Wexler cried out, his rifle clattering to the ground, as he clutched a hand that was suddenly a ruin of blood and splintered bone. Standing in the doorway, her face pale but resolute, was Brianna. In her hands, she held one of Bo's heavy pistols, smoke curling from the barrel. She had not aimed to kill. She had aimed to protect. It was over. Surrounded and defeated, Corbin Wexler collapsed as Sheriff Brody clamped irons on his wrists. The siege of Maverick Ridge had been broken, not just by bullets, but by the conscience of a town and the indomitable will of a woman who had finally fought back. The aftermath of the siege was a landscape of quiet devastation and profound relief. As the sun rose, it illuminated a yard scarred by battle, but the air itself felt cleansed. Dr. Peterson tended to the wounded, including the graze on Bo's arm, while the ranchers and townsfolk who had ridden to their aid stood as silent, supportive witnesses to the battle's end. Sheriff Brody approached Bo, holding the leather-bound ledger that had changed everything. "We've got Wexler in custody, along with 2 of his men who are already talking," the sheriff said, his voice filled with weary satisfaction. "This ledger combined with their testimony, he'll be put away for the murder of Robert Dawson and a lifetime of theft." He handed the book to Bo. "This belongs to Mrs. Dawson." Bo took the ledger and walked to the porch where Brianna stood with Samuel. Their gazes met across the yard, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but an ocean of gratitude and a dawning of hope so bright it made his heart ache. He held the book out to her. "It's over, Brianna." She took it, her father's last testament, and clutched it to her chest as tears of release streamed down her face. "Thank you, Bo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." "You saved me too," he answered, his voice uncharacteristically soft. His world had been quiet and empty. They had brought danger, but they had also brought purpose and life, filling the vast, lonely spaces inside him. Later that day, after the community had departed, leaving a fragile peace behind, Bo found Brianna by the corral. Samuel was nearby, his wooden horse, galloping bravely across the dusty ground, a sight of pure, unburdened childhood. Bo came to stand beside her, the comfortable silence, a testament to all they had endured together. "Wexler's gone," he said quietly. "You're free now, Brianna. You and Samuel can go anywhere you want. Oregon, California. Anywhere." He said the words because they were true, but the thought of them leaving left a hollow ache in his chest. Brianna turned to him, her sky-blue eyes searching his face. "All those weeks on the run," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I was only running from something. I never knew what I was running to. Not until I ended up in your stable." She took a step closer, her hand gently touching the bandages on his arm. "This is the first place Samuel has truly smiled in months. It's the first place that has ever felt like a sanctuary." Beau's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked down at this woman of impossible courage, at the family he had never dared to dream of. He reached out his large, calloused hand, cupping her cheek with infinite tenderness. "Stay," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer contain. "Stay forever by my side." Brianna leaned into his touch, a radiant smile chasing away the last of the shadows. "We're home, Beau," she said. "We're finally home." As Samuel ran over to join them, Beau Maverick wrapped his arms around them, both his great, lonely heart, finally irrevocably full. The giant of Maverick Ridge had found his family forged in the crucible of fire and fighting for the promise of a shared dawn. And so the story of Maverick Ridge became a new legend whispered on the Montana winds. It was no longer a story of a lonely giant, but a tale of how a fortress, built to keep the world out, became a home that held a family in. It's a testament to the fact that courage isn't about the size of the man, but the size of what he's willing to protect. Beau, Brianna, and Samuel didn't just survive the darkness that hunted them. They built a new life from its ashes, proving that family isn't always the one you're born into, but the one you'd fight and die for. Theirs is a story that reminds us that even in the harshest landscapes of the Wild West, the most powerful force has always been the unshakable strength of the human heart. If this story of courage, struggle, and the unlikely birth of a family resonated with you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed the journey. Share it with others who love epic tales of the Old West, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories from the frontier to share with you, tales of grit, justice, and the enduring spirit of humanity. Thank you for listening.